Rebel News is headed to Spain to the UN climate change conference, and boy, the Liberal government won't be happy about it. Now, we won't be taking a carbon-neutral catamaran like teenage truant climate activist Greta Thunberg. We need your help to get there the old-fashioned way. Cian Bexte tracking down Greta Thunberg in Edmonton and then confronting her adult handlers, as well as my coverage of the Greta Thunberg climate rally, where we greeted her with our crowdfunded How Dare You billboard truck, are two of our most seen videos of 2019. Why is that? Well, it's because people are desperate for the other side of the story, the normal person's side of the story, the minivan driving, hockey mom, oil patch dad, daily commute on bad roads in cold weather, when 6 months of the year is winter side of the story, when the mainstream media and our politics are just so saturated with one side of the climate change narrative, the narrative that a carbon tax on everything you do will somehow change the weather. And because of our journalistic mission here at Rebel News to tell the other side of the story, I've gone to the big annual United Nations climate change conferences in Morocco, Bonn, Germany, and Katowice, Poland. Now, these are meetings where politicians, unelected bureaucrats, and international elites make policies and decisions in a far-off land that make your life more expensive every single day back at home. And they want to do it behind closed doors and without any scrutiny. And when I applied to go to my first UN conference, they tried to keep me out by saying they do not accredit advocacy journalists, which is absolutely crazy because the entire conference is full of pro-carbon tax journalists. What the UN meant was they weren't going to accredit a pro-fossil fuel, anti-carbon tax, anti-global warming doomsday cult journalist like myself. Now, we fought that ban, and they eventually let us in. I went to that first conference in Morocco, where I showed you the parking lots full of idling buses, and the disposable Potemkin village built in the middle of the Moroccan desert to house the thing. I also showed you how this conference on using less of everything was watering the desert ground every morning to keep the dust off the shoes of the delegates going into the climate change meetings. And I showed you what it was like for the rest of Marrakesh outside of the conference. Oh yeah, and I also confronted a Canadian delegate and his press secretary, an Aboriginal chief from Manitoba who went to Morocco to bash the oil sands, one of the largest vehicles for wealth and jobs for Canada's Indigenous peoples. And for that, for telling the truth and for doing my job, I was banned from these conferences going forward at the request of the Canadian government. Actually, it was because of my dangerous questions in Morocco that all rebel journalists were banned from all UN conferences, including David Menzies, who tried to report on the UN Compact for Migration conference, incidentally, back in Marrakesh. Just look at this letter here. This is the UN declining my request for media accreditation again, even though I jumped through all of their hoops to get it. And this is my own government using the UN as a proxy to stop me from reporting on things that matter deeply to Canadians that are happening in other countries. It reads, decline due to complaints received about the organization from government delegates at COP22, that's Morocco, concerning harassment. Now, I've never harassed anybody in my entire life, and I recorded all my interactions with people in Morocco. Contrarian questions amount to harassment when the Liberal government is on the receiving end of them, I guess. However, banning me for a false and completely ridiculous reason has done nothing to prevent me from doing real journalism from these conferences. And frankly, I'm a little glad to be outside the conference, because when you're inside of them, sure, the Wi-Fi is good and the air conditioning is great, but all you get is press releases. And then you're stuck with a bunch of journalists who are happy to be contained and managed and regurgitating the official narrative coming out of the conference, completely verbatim. I think after 4 years, you at home probably know that's not my style. When I went to Bonn, Germany and Poland, I showed you all the crazy things that were happening outside the conferences, like the hundreds of diesel-fueled heaters and light towers they were using to power their anti-fossil fuel conference, like the Greenpeace sailboat that was actually also powered by diesel, and the weirdo art installations that accompany these conferences all across the cities they're in. And I'm going back this year, even though, yet again, they've declined my accreditation at the request of the Canadian government. The UN might be able to keep me out of the boring inside of the conference, but there is still a ton of news to find out there on the streets. The conference is in Madrid this December, and instead of going with a videographer, I'm going with my friend and colleague, Cian Bexty. Two troublemaking rebels are always better than one, and Cian is not afraid, as you know, to confront people and ask them tough questions. Cian and I are also pretty self-contained. We are our own cameramen. We do most of our work out in the field from our cell phones. We've rented an Airbnb and booked the cheapest flights we can find to keep the costs of our trip low. But it will still cost us thousands and thousands of dollars for both of us to get there and work and tell the other side of the story you won't learn about in those regurgitated liberal press releases they call stories over at the CBC. Now, can you help us cover the cost to go to Madrid? You can donate to offset the expenses of our trip at rebelun.com. While you're there, you can see some of our previous work too. Now, we don't get $1.5 billion from Justin Trudeau like the CBC does to do our journalism, and we will never take a penny in bailout money from any government. We rely on the generous support of our supporters to do the work that we do. We are fiercely independent. That's never going to change. We are going to track down the newsmakers and show you what really goes on at these closed-off conferences that cost the taxpayer thousands and thousands and thousands of dollars to send our politicians to. Cian and I are accountability journalists, and we are going to Madrid to continue that mission. If you can help us, you can do that at that donation page, rebelun.com. Thank you. For Rebel News, I'm Sheila Gunn Reid. Rebel News is going to Madrid to report from the UN Climate Change Conference, whether the Liberals like it or not. To donate to support our independent journalism from on the ground in Madrid, go to rebelun.com.